This will be a second lecture on the patriarchal narratives. It'll also be the concluding of a series of lectures on the book of Genesis by me. My name is Dr. Joe Sprinkle. In the last lecture, we looked at certain themes in the Abraham cycle, but now we're going to look at some further themes in the Abraham cycle, and then also themes in the Jacob cycle and also the Joseph cycle. In the Abraham cycle, we see grace and judgment in the Sodom and Gomorrah narrative of Genesis 18 and 19. God's mercy would spare Sodom if only 10 righteous people were found there. Genesis 18, verse 20, the Lord said, "The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, and their sin is so grievous that I will go down to see what they have done is as bad as the outcry that has reached me. If not, I will know." The men turned away and went toward Sodom, but Abraham remained standing before the Lord. Then Abraham approached him and said, "Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked? What if there are 50 righteous people in the city? Will you really sweep it away and not spare the place for the sake of the 50 righteous people in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to kill the righteous with the wicked, treating the righteous and the wicked alike. Far be it from you. Will not the judge of all the earth do right?" The Lord said, "If I find 50 righteous people in the city of Sodom, I will spare the whole place for their sake." Then Abraham spoke again. "Now that I have been so bold as to speak to the Lord, though I am nothing but dust and ashes, what if the number of the righteous is 5 less than 50? Will you destroy the whole city because of 5 people? If I find 45 there," he said, "I will not destroy it." Once again he spoke to him, "What if only 40 are found there?" He said, "For the sake of 40, I will not do it." And then he goes down to 30, and he goes all the way, verse 32, down to 10. Then he said, "May the Lord not be angry, but let me speak just once more. What if only 10 can be found there, 10 righteous people?" He answered, "For the sake of 10, I would not destroy it." God's mercy would spare Sodom, as wicked as it was, even if 10 righteous people were found there. That says something about God's grace. And it also says something about the influence of the righteous on God's judgment of a particular nation or people. We also see something about the grace of God when he saved Abraham's nephew Lot from Sodom. In Genesis 19, 2 angels had come to the city. Verse 15, with the coming of dawn, the angels urged Lot, saying, "Hurry, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, or you will be swept away when the city is punished." When he hesitated, the men grasped his hands and the hand of his wife and his 2 daughters and led them safely out of the city, for the Lord was merciful to them. As soon as they had brought them out, one of them said, "Flee for your lives. Don't look back and don't stop anywhere in the plain. Flee to the mountains, or you will be swept away." Now again, by grace, God saved Abraham's nephew Lot from Sodom. Now, Lot was relatively righteous, though he was a rather flawed character. When a crowd came wanting to rape the angels, which they understood to be men rather than angels, when they wanted to rape the angels, Lot offered his daughters instead. That wasn't the most noble thing to do. And also, Lot later commits incest with his daughters when he gets drunk and they seduce him. And so it turns out there were not 10 righteous people in Sodom, and even the so-called righteous man Lot wasn't all that good. And this sealed Sodom's fate. And yet God did spare Lot by sending the 2 angels to save him, even if Lot didn't really deserve it. More on God's judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 19. The men came, and before they had gone to bed, all the men from every part of the city of Sodom, both young and old, surrounded the house. They called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we can have sex with them." The idiom in Hebrew is "so that we can know them," but this is the correct interpretation. Lot went outside to meet them and shut the door behind him. And he said, "No, my friends, don't do this wicked thing. Look, I have 2 daughters who have never slept with a man. Let me bring them out to you, and you can do what you like with them. But don't do anything to these men, for they have come under the protection of my roof." And then after this incident, then the Lord rained down burning sulfur on Sodom and Gomorrah from the Lord out of the heavens. And thus he overthrew those cities and the entire plain, including all those living in the cities, and also the vegetation in the land. But Lot's wife looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. Some comments on Sodom and Gomorrah's narrative. Sodom's specific sins were inhospitality and sexual perversion. Specifically, the men of Sodom wanted to homosexually rape Lot's angelic guests. They didn't realize they were angels, but that's what they wanted to do to the guests. And indeed, the word sodomy, which is a term for homosexual sex, is derived from this story. Lot's wife disobeyed the angels, looked back, and died, being turned into a pillar of salt, symbolic that she had not forsaken Sodom and its sins, and therefore she was judged along with them. Another theme in the Abrahamic cycle are the origins of the surrounding nations. In Genesis 19, you have the origin of Ammon and Moab. This was from Lot's incest with his daughters, as described in Genesis 19, 30 through 38. And then the Arabs come from Abraham's son by Hagar, the son being Ishmael. Genesis 25 describes that. And then if we can skip to later narratives, we also have the origin of the nation of Edom, who came from Esau, the twin brother of Jacob, in Genesis 36. So the surrounding nations are all related to Abraham in one way or another. Ammon and Moab through Abraham's nephew, the Arabs through Hagar and Ishmael, and the Edomites through Esau, the twin brother of Jacob, who was the son of Isaac, who was the grandson of Abraham. Another theme in the Abrahamic cycle is the testing of faith. And we already saw that in Genesis 22, but let me look at it again. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. That's the key word. He said to him, "Abraham, here I am," he replied. Then God said, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about." And so Abraham packed up and went to the mountain. And when they reached the place God told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham!" "Here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." You see, fearing God has to do with being willing to obey God's commands. Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." Now, in this story, Abraham's faith is put to the test, whether he really believed God enough to risk his own son, Isaac. And Abraham passed that test. And for that reason, he's a great example of faith. But this is a reminder that God can also put believers today to the test and test their faith. It happened to Abraham. It happened to Israel in the wilderness. It happened to Job in the book of Job. It happened to Jesus in the wilderness. God, even today, can test our faith with circumstances that challenge us. Now, in the story, God provided a ram to substitute for Isaac. And this illustrates the concept later on in atoning sacrifice, the idea of substitutionary sacrifice. The ram substitutes for Isaac. The animals in the atoning sacrifices substitute for the worshiper. When we get to the New Testament, the Lamb of God, Jesus, is a substitutionary sacrifice for us. Now I'd like to move on to themes in the story of Jacob in Genesis 25b through chapter 36. We see in this story flawed saints and the mystery of divine election. Jacob was the son of Isaac, but Jacob was a lying, deceiving trickster who cheated his brother Esau out of his birthright for a bowl of stew, Genesis 25, 29 through 34, and stole by deceit his blessing by pretending to be Esau and fooling his blind father Isaac in Genesis 27. He was married to two women initially, Leah and Rachel. They were wives of Jacob, but they were bitter, jealous, sharp-tongued shrews at times. And yet God used these people. God, by grace and mercy, works even through flawed saints to accomplish his purposes. We also see the theme of poetic justice, because Jacob gets a taste of his own medicine. Jacob is forced to flee up to Haran area where his uncle Laban was, and Laban's uncle Laban tricked Jacob into marrying his daughter Leah, the girl that Jacob really didn't want, so that Jacob had to work hard for him an additional 7 years in order to marry the daughter he did want, Rachel. This story is in Genesis 29, verse 15 through 29. On the wedding night, they switched girls. Apparently, Jacob was too drunk to tell the difference. It wasn't until he woke up in the morning that he realized he had married Leah rather than Rachel, which is a commentary on not getting drunk, I suppose. The trickster got tricked. He got a taste of his own medicine. It illustrates the principle found in Galatians 6:7, a man reaps what he sows. Jacob received poetic justice for his own trickery. We also have the origin of the 12 tribes as a theme in Jacob's cycle of Genesis. Jacob, after he wrestles with the Lord, is given the new name Israel. It was changed to Israel, which means God strives, after Jacob wrestled with the angel of the Lord, Genesis 32, verses 22 through 30. The angel of the Lord in the Old Testament is often a manifestation of God or Christ. We could call it a theophany or even a Christophany. And so after he wrestled with the angel of the Lord, God himself, he was renamed Israel and is given a new relationship with God. Well, out of Israel, or Jacob, will come the 12 tribes of Israel. And that came through his two freeborn wives, Rachel and Leah, and his two slave wives, Bilhah and Zilpah. So you have Leah, and you can see all the various children that she had, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. Also it mentions a daughter, Dinah. And then Zilpah, Leah's slave, had two children, Gad and Asher, and Bilhah, who was Rachel's slave, had two children, Dan and Naphtali. And then Rachel herself had two children, Joseph and Benjamin, and out of Joseph also comes Manasseh and Ephraim. And so those are the original 12 tribes. What will happen later on is that Levi becomes a priestly tribe and is no longer counted as a separate tribe. But then Joseph, which had two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, those two sons become one of them at least becomes a replacement for Levi in counting to 12, so that Joseph has two tribes that come out of him. So that's the origin of the 12 tribes of Israel, though technically you might say it's 13 tribes. Now I move on to themes from the Joseph story in Genesis 37 through 50. A little bit about Joseph. He was the spoiled favorite son of Jacob, the child of his favorite wife, Rachel. In Genesis 37 through 50 is all about Joseph. And the Lord was with Joseph, and hence, even though he was mistreated by his brothers and sold into slavery, he rose to prominence in Potiphar's household because the Lord was with Joseph. Indeed, not only does he rise to prominence in Potiphar's household, he eventually becomes an administrator of the grain during a famine in Egypt. And so this all goes back to the fact that God was with Joseph and is the real hero of the Joseph story. He was falsely accused of trying to seduce Potiphar's wife, and so Joseph was sent to prison, but through his prophetic gift of dream interpretation, God delivered him from prison, and this leads him to interpret Pharaoh's dream about 7 fat cows and 7 skinny cows. And through this dream to Pharaoh, God used Joseph to warn that there'd be 7 years of famine following 7 years of plenty. As a result of this dream interpretation, Joseph was made an administrator of Egypt's grain. And in this story, we see God's providence. Genesis 45, verse 5 through 8. After his brothers come to Egypt, and ultimately Joseph reveals himself to them after testing them, he says to them, "Now don't be worried or angry with yourselves for selling me here, because God sent me ahead of you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there will be 5 more years without plowing or harvesting. God sent me ahead of you to establish you as a remnant within the land and to keep you alive by a great deliverance. Therefore, it was not you that sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household, and ruler over all the land of Egypt." By providence, Joseph was in the right place at the right time to save his family from the terrible 7 years of famine. Again, Genesis 45, 7 and 8. "God sent me ahead of you to establish you as a remnant within the land and to keep you alive by a great deliverance. Therefore, it was not you who sent me here, but God." By this providential act, God preserved the seed promise. Otherwise, the entire seed of Abraham might have starved to death. We also see an example of forgiveness in Joseph's story. Genesis 50 and verse 15, when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him?" So they sent word to Joseph saying, "Your father left us these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father." And when their message came to him, Joseph wept. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. "We are your slaves," they said. But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. Again, we have an example of God's providence. We also have an example of Joseph being willing to forgive the wrongdoings of his brothers. And then finally, we have messianic and prophetic themes. We have the story of Tamar in Genesis 38. Tamar ended up seducing Judah and bearing a child through him when she dressed up as a prostitute and didn't reveal who she was. And oddly enough, Tamar is in the line of Jesus Christ. You might, ask the reason why is this little soap opera story in the Bible? And it's because God providentially used even this wicked act of Tamar and also Judah, who allowed himself to be seduced, to prepare for the birth of Jesus Christ the Messiah. Genesis 49:10 is a promise with messianic implications. There it talks about the tribe of Judah. For the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet until Shiloh comes, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. Now, Shiloh is somewhat debated, but it may mean something like him to whom it is belong. But the scepter, which is a symbol of kingship, will not depart until Shiloh, we might say Messiah, the one to whom it belongs, comes. And so this looks like it is a messianic prophecy. And for this reason, it was always assumed that there would be kingship in Israel someday, and it would come from the tribe of Judah. Judah was the royal messianic line. And again, ironically, it goes through the seduction of Judah by Tamar. And then finally, you have the seed promise that culminates in Christ. You keep having the seed promise narrowing down. So it started off broad. The seed of the woman was to crush the serpent's head in Genesis 3 and verse 15. And, the seed of the woman was basically everybody. But then the seed of Shem was to dominate Canaan in Genesis 9, 26 and 27. And Japheth and Ham was to live in the tents of Shem. And so now the seed promise narrows to the line of Shem. But then the seed promise goes through the line of Abraham in Genesis 12, 1 through 3. And then in Genesis 49, it narrows down to the seed of Judah. And then finally, it narrows down to the seed of David, and out of the seed of David comes the Messiah, Jesus Christ. So that seed promise in Genesis, it begins in Genesis, but little by little it narrows down to culminate in Jesus Christ. Well, this was a few more themes in the patriarchal narratives. And this concludes my lectures on the book of Genesis. My name is Dr. Joe Sprinkle.